Okay, the next part of this video this next video, part of the video, or next video, video number 2, what we're going to be doing is looking at what happens after we've made some of our basic geometry. Now, one of the important things, I guess, to remember is a general principle when you're modeling in Max is that there are a few things that you need to sort of just be aware of as you're making things. One, this will be most evident when we start doing sub-object modeling, which is when we start doing transformations on these standard primitives. But the principal issue is one that you have to be very careful. You have to actually craft what you're doing quite carefully, because if you are kind of a bit sloppy in your modeling, that'll often come out in some geometry that you may not necessarily want. Alright, but this will become a bit more obvious as we progress through. Now, what I wanted to show you first up is, we'll just go to the full panel view to do this, is that one of the things you often do in Max is you set up scenes, and the scenes will contain all of the geometry, all the assets, the textures and the lighting that you have to have a particular view. Now, Max isn't like Revit, where you need to have the entire building in order to create a scene. Max will just render what you choose to show it. Now, the way it does that is by looking through a camera, and you can place and control the nature of the camera that records that scene, lighting and textures. I'm just in this lesson going to take you through a few kind of basic steps on how to get a scene constructed. Now, one of the first things I'm going to do, just something I do when I get started with these things, is that we currently have a whole bunch of objects here which have certain sort of values too, but they're floating in space. Now, what I will generally do is I will create a plane, okay, which is a geometry which is super thin, has no kind of Z value, and I'll just drag that across from left to right. You can see in the top frame and release, and you can see updated in the perspective window that there's this now kind of a ground plane, and more particularly what you can see that there are shadows which are being cast onto that ground plane. Now, this just helps us with getting a sense of context and bounce, lighting bounce and that sort of stuff in it. Okay, now this is not a lit scene. You can certainly render it out and hit the render button and get a kind of version of this, but the lighting quality and the texturing quality is all pretty primitive. Okay, and we probably want something a little bit more sophisticated. Now, having put that plane in place, the next thing I would do is I would go to my Create tab. I'm still on that, Create tab, and I'd hit Camera. Okay. Now, in previous versions of Max and its plugin V-Ray, which I'll talk about in a minute, it mattered what sort of camera you used, whether it's the standard or V-Ray. I'll show you what to do with the standard one because it's fairly straightforward. Okay, now what we will normally do is, using a standard, is we'd select a target camera. Okay, so I select it, it goes to blue, and then we have to place it within the scene. So if I come over here onto the top, it's generally the process of doing, into the top view, I left click and then I drag out. You can see a camera icon appears, and I drag and I release. Okay, so it's left click, drag and release to put a camera in the scene. Now, what I'm now able to do is I'm now able to, in a minute when I show you, look through that camera from where it's located. Okay, now before I do that, there's a couple of more parameters through here I need to explain to you in order to modify that scene. Most important which is the select and move one. Okay, now if I left click that, okay, what you'll see is that if I just maximize, for example, the perspective panel here, if I maximize that, what you'll see is that if I select something, you get what's called a Waldo. Okay, it's a three-way set of arrows: red for the X plane, green for the Y, and Z for the blue direction. Okay, and when you run your cursor over these things, okay, it's probably a little easier if I show you in some geometry. So I'll select this particular geometry, okay, and you can see if I get close to it, as I run my cursor over various parts of it, either the X, the Y, or the Z, they turn yellow. I can also go in this instance, the YZ plane, the ZX plane. If I come over here, I can, if I'm clever, oopsie, I should be able to get the YZ. I can't do it. I'll have to switch around. Now, what do these do? What they allow you to do is to move that particular object. If I just left click and drag, okay, you can allow it to move in that particular direction. Through the Z, through the Y. Okay. If I go back to the 4 windows, when I undertake these things, you'll see that it gets updated in the other windows. Okay. So Z and Y. And as I said, you can move in 2 planes at all if both are selected. So just a little bit of practicing on that will show you how to move anything. Another device or option we have available to us is this one, the select and rotate. So I select that, you'll see there's a similar kind of 3-coloured set of parameters, but in this instance I'll just so maximize this one. In this instance, if I select our cylinder again, you'll notice that I can rotate it, okay, through just by selecting that thing and dragging it. I can also, if I come down, I'll just Control Z that to return it. I can also enter in a value down the bottom here. Okay, so if I say 45, for example, sorry, this was the one I want, 45, it will rotate it through that value, that 0, that at 45. Okay, so essentially it's going at 45 degrees through the Y. If I select this one and I make that 135, okay, again it's rotated a certain value. I can take it back to 0. Okay, the next thing we can look at adjusting is select and scale. So I click on that one and you'll see instead of the circles we head for the circumference, or the arrows for the select and move, you have instead, I'll just go to the 4 panel to show you this, is that we now have it available to us in a similar way. If all 3 sides are selected, it will scale uniformly. Okay, if one side is selected, it will scale just on those dimensions, just on those axes. Okay, so I'll just bring that out and make that a bit obvious. And then again. Okay, so so that's select and scale, select and rotate, and select and move. Okay, now what do we need to know all of these things? Because if I now select the camera and go back to our 4-way panel, what I can see is if I come down on the left hand side here, is that the camera is sitting right at 0, 0, 0, 0, right at the Z equals 0. Now the reality of course is that people are a little bit taller than that, okay, and they sit up off the ground. So what I will need to do, I'll show you why I need to do it in a minute, is I'll need to pull up the camera just a little bit. Okay, you'll notice too that the camera there are 2 aspects to it. You have the camera itself and the view cone, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And you also have the camera target. Okay, so I can also select that, or I can select all of them, or I can select just the camera. Okay. If I select just the camera will move. I select all three, the camera and the target will move. If I select just the target will move. Alright, now why is this all important? Because if we come to our major screen here, and I might, just for the purposes of making things a bit easier to see, turn this into a basic grey. Okay, is that instead of looking through the perspective viewport, which we have here, you'll notice that I have other ways that I can look through things. And you notice when I come to camera, I now have camera 1. That's telling me you have the option of viewing in this panel through the lens of camera 1. So I'll left click that, and there it is. That's what I can see. Now what we're looking at, of course, is that the camera is sitting right on Z equals 0, so it's looking straight ahead. But it's looking at ground level. So what I might want to do, as I suggested to you previously, is I might want to just come over and select the camera in one of the sides and just drag it up slightly, and if we do that you can see it's updated in the perspective viewport. Right. I can also, as I said, I can select the camera target. I can pull that around a little bit and you can see that gets updated again in the camera perspective viewport, and I can even bring it up. We can look up slightly. Okay. Alright, now you'll remember that in making the boxes, one of the ways in which we could go back and add information to the box was by adjusting them in the modifier tab. Now exactly the same thing happens with the camera, and so when I select it, I go to the modifier tab, we have a whole bunch of parameters that you can see here on the right hand side. Okay, and it's telling me what the field of view and what the lens size is. Okay, it also gives me a series of different kinds of stock lens options, and if I just click through those, you'll notice one that the come back to it again. One that the select the camera. Okay, one that the field of view changes, as you can see. Okay, and then as I increase in size, I can change the lens type from a wide angle to a zoom. Okay, I can also adjust by just pushing up and down qualities in that. Okay, so I can just change what it is that I see. Now there's some things to be done. What you will notice is as you get more extreme in your lens and your field of view, is that you get error beginning to occur in terms of the vertical alignment of some of your objects. Now we'll deal with that in a minute, in a while, but what I first want to do is talk about why it is that we look through, what happens when we have a camera in this scene, and how do we start to light and texture it. And to do that I need to do a couple of very basic things to my parameters, my render setup, in order to start looking at what the scene is that I'm trying to create. Okay, now the first thing I need to do in a scene such as this is I need to put a sun in. Okay, now, and I need to assign materials, and I need to the selection as well. Before I do any of that though, there's another but. One of the first things I need to do if I'm using V-Ray, which is the rendering engine I'm going to be using, is I need to assign it, I need to tell Max that when it starts rendering this environment, okay, it needs to use a particular type of algorithm and software called V-Ray. The default way it'll do is a scanline render. So if I just produce, sorry, so we got this one. It's too big. Alright, we'll forget that for a minute. Now, one of the things I'm going to have to do is to fix that with other things, is that I need to essentially assign a renderer. Okay, now to do that I go to, where are we, render setup. Okay, so I can access it from this button. I can also go rendering and go to render setup. Okay, and what I'm going to do, what happens when I open that up, so I'll just click this one, is that a whole series of properties turn up. Now mine's set up as V-Ray. What I'll do is I'll return it to what its default condition would be and talk you through it. Okay, so we'll go back to what it would look like. Now when you first open up a rendering environment such as this one, if I hit render, you'll see that's what happens. Okay, it's got it's telling us that there are objects, that they have geometry, and there's no shadows, there's no bounce, there's no sky, there's no sense of kind of reality to the scene. It's very kind of plasticky and wooden. Okay, but that's sufficient for you just to have a look at where things are. But what we want to do, as I said, is we want to start thinking about, we want to use V-Ray rather than default scanline. Now to get to that, I need to, when yours comes in, it will probably look like this. There'll be common parameters, etc. There are a set of tabs that you can use or not. But we start with common, and under common tab, we just hold and pull up. We need to go to assign renderer. Okay, so I open that up, and then next to where it says production, material editor, and active shader, I click on this first one here, choose renderer, and I choose V-Ray. Okay, now you'll have either V-Ray demo if you're using this at home, or V-Ray edu, which is the one that you should be using in the UniSA pools. So hit OK, and that changes a whole bunch of the settings that are now possible for the renderer itself. Now, first things first. Okay, what that now releases in our rest of our create environment, and I can just turn that off for a second, is that when I start to make lights, it'll come in normally that you'll have a target light, free light, and a mental ray sky portal. Mental ray is the native renderer to 3ds Max, and it can be used, but most people who are serious about rendering and doing good quality images will use V-Ray. So what I want to use is a V-Ray light in the scene. Okay, so you can see we're under the create tab, and then the lights, and then my V-Ray lights that I have available to me. And the one I want to select is a V-Ray sun. So I left click that, okay, and it's activated, and I'll just put a sun into this scene. Now I'll put it so it's going across from where the field of view is. If I just drag that out, left click, and then release once, I'll now get this pop up that's perfectly normal. It asks, would you like to automatically add a V-Ray sky environment map? I will say yes to that. Okay. Now what that's going to do is it's going to put a background into my render, which makes it look like it's realistic lighting. Okay. Now if we get in close on this panel, you'll see that we have a small icon with an arrow, which is the direction of the sun, and this is the target. Now the sun and the target work much like the camera in terms of having directionality. Okay, so if I hit the select and move, I can move the sun around in particular directions. Okay, now V-Ray and Max treats the sun as being at an infinite distance, and so lines in the photons of light it's calculating are in parallel. So it doesn't matter whether you have it close like this or far away. It's not going to make a lot of difference, or any difference, in terms of how it will work in terms of bounce. But generally you put it out of your scene, so it's essentially out of the way. So if we come back to our 4 panels, we'll notice in when we look at the side views, we'll just scroll out to find it, like the camera, it's sitting on the ground. Okay, and of course the sun is not on the ground. So what we will do is we'll lift it up, okay, and so that it's shining at an angle, alright, into the scene. Which means if I come back and I refresh this camera view that we're looking at, we can now see that it's some more light has come into the scene, and there are shadows that are coming about as a consequence of it. Now, one of the things that we will need to do in dealing with V-Ray is dealing with a thing called the intensity multiplier. If you're using a V-Ray Sun but a standard camera, okay, V-Ray tends to be overpowered in terms of its intensity calculation. So what I would do in the first instance is just to reduce this down to 0.1. So I do that 0.1. Okay, so that will give you a softer light, a more manageable light when we come into it. Now, so if I then want to go and render this scene, okay, right, so I'm just going to change something in my render setup, so I'm just going to pause this for a second and it